How did a perfect picture of this turn into that? Let's dive into this captivating tale of love and tradition. Far away in the heart of Africa, surrounded by dense forests, rivers, and hills, lay the village of Ibala. Ibala was a place untouched by the modern world, its traditions as old as the trees that swayed in the wind and its culture fiercely protected by its people. At the helm of Ibala was King Adisa, a revered leader known for his wisdom, strength, and love for his people. His rule was just, and his heart was kind, yet like the land he governed, his thoughts were deeply rooted in the traditions passed down from his ancestors. One fateful year, the village of Ibala received a visitor, someone who would change the course of its history in ways that no one could have predicted. Her name was Elizabeth Whitman, a white American woman in her early 30s. Elizabeth had traveled to Africa with a group of researchers, drawn by a desire to study the ancient cultures and customs that had remained untouched by the outside world. A passionate anthropologist, Elizabeth had always been fascinated by the diversity of human experience, and when she heard of Ibala, she was determined to see it for herself. From the moment she set foot in Ibala, Elizabeth was captivated. The village was alive with colors, sounds, and smells that overwhelmed her senses. The people were warm and welcoming, their hospitality far exceeding her expectations. The vast, open landscapes, the ceremonies, the dances around the fire, and the traditional songs all mesmerized her. But most captivating of all was the village's King Adisa. King Adisa, a man in his early 40s, was a towering figure with a regal presence. His skin was dark, his eyes piercing, and his voice commanded attention. As the ruler of Ibala, he had long been accustomed to visitors, but there was something about Elizabeth that intrigued him. She was different from the other outsiders who had come before her. She showed genuine respect for the customs of his people and a sincere desire to learn. Unlike others who saw the village as an exotic relic of the past, Elizabeth saw Ibala as a living, breathing place, filled with people whose stories mattered. Elizabeth's stay, originally planned for a few weeks, stretched into months. She immersed herself in village life, learning the local language, participating in their ceremonies, and even adopting some of their daily routines. Over time, Elizabeth and Adisa's paths began to cross more frequently. They spoke often, sharing stories about their respective worlds. Adisa was fascinated by Elizabeth's tales of the modern world, but he was also cautious, wary of the changes that technology and Western influence could bring to his village. Elizabeth, in turn, was captivated by Adisa's dedication to his people and his deep connection to his heritage. As the months passed, what began as a friendship blossomed into love. Elizabeth found herself falling for the king of Ibala, a man so different from anyone she had ever known. And to her surprise, King Adisa felt the same. Despite the cultural differences between them, their love grew strong, built on mutual respect and admiration. One evening, under the clear African sky, as the stars shimmered like diamonds above them, King Adisa asked Elizabeth to become his queen. It was an offer that took her breath away. She had come to Ibala as an observer, a visitor from a faraway land, but now she was being asked to become a permanent part of its story. After a moment of reflection, Elizabeth agreed. She loved Adisa and the village that had become her second home. The news of their marriage spread quickly throughout Ibala, and while there were some initial whispers of surprise, after all, it was not every day that a white woman married an African king. The village soon accepted her with open arms. Elizabeth became Queen Ezen, adopting an African name as a symbol of her new identity. She embraced her role with grace, dedicating herself to learning more about the people she now served as their queen. But with the title of queen came the full weight of the village's traditions, including one that Elizabeth had never fully prepared herself for: polygamy. In Ibala, the king was expected to have multiple wives. It was a tradition as old as the kingdom itself, one that symbolized the strength and continuity of the royal line. While Elizabeth had known about this custom, she had hoped that her love for Adisa and the child she soon carried would be enough to keep him from seeking more wives. Several months into their marriage, Elizabeth gave birth to a son, a boy they named Adewale. His birth was a joyous occasion, celebrated with feasts and ceremonies throughout the village. Elizabeth believed that her son, the heir to the throne, would secure her place as Adisa's only wife. She was certain that her love and the bond they shared would make him resist the pressure to take on more wives. But the traditions of Ibala were stronger than even love. Despite the deep affection Adisa held for Elizabeth, he was bound by the expectations of his people. The elders of the village, who served as his counsel, reminded him of his duties as king, including the need to marry multiple wives to ensure the stability of the royal lineage. To Elizabeth's heartbreak, Adisa soon took 2 more wives, both women from noble families within Ibala. Elizabeth struggled to accept this reality. She had entered into marriage with the belief that love could transcend tradition, but now she found herself sharing her husband with other women. Her dream of a monogamous life with Adisa was shattered, and though the king continued to love her deeply, the presence of his new wives created a distance between them. The other women were kind to her, respectful of her position as the first wife, but the pain of sharing her husband weighed heavily on her heart. In the midst of her sorrow, Elizabeth turned her focus to her son, Adewale. She was determined to give him the best of both worlds, the wisdom of the ancient traditions of Ibala and the knowledge of the modern world she had left behind. She began teaching him to read and write, using books and materials she had brought from America. Elizabeth believed that education would be the key to Adewale's future, allowing him to bridge the gap between the village's past and the future that awaited beyond its borders. However, her attempts to introduce modern ideas into the life of her son did not sit well with King Adisa. He had always been cautious about Western influence, fearing that it could erode the traditions that had kept Ibala strong for generations. One day, as Elizabeth was teaching Adewale how to write his name, Adisa entered the room. His expression darkened as he saw his son holding a pen, focused on the piece of paper before him. "Elizabeth," Adisa said, his voice heavy with disapproval. "What are you doing?" Elizabeth looked up, surprised by the tone of his voice. "I'm teaching Adewale to write," she replied. "He needs to learn. The world is changing, Adisa. He needs to be prepared." But Adisa shook his head, his brow furrowed. "He is the future king of Ibala. He must learn the ways of our people, not the ways of the world outside. This is not the path for him." Elizabeth's heart sank. She had always known that Adisa was deeply committed to his people's traditions, but she had hoped that he would see the value in education and technology. She tried to reason with him, explaining that Adewale could honor both his African heritage and embrace the knowledge of the modern world. But Adisa remained firm. To him, teaching their son to write was a step toward abandoning the customs that had defined their people for centuries. As the days passed, the tension between Elizabeth and Adisa grew. She felt increasingly isolated, trapped between her love for the man she had married and her desire to give her son a future that extended beyond the boundaries of Ibala. The other wives, content with their roles in the palace, did not understand her struggle. They saw no issue with raising their children in the traditional ways, but Elizabeth could not shake the feeling that she was depriving her son of the opportunities he deserved. The final breaking point came one evening when Adisa forbade Elizabeth from teaching Adewale anymore about the outside world. He wanted their son to grow up as a true heir of Ibala, steeped in the knowledge of their ancestors, not distracted by the allure of the West. For Elizabeth, this was too much. She realized that as much as she loved Adisa, she could not continue to live in a world where her son's potential was stifled by tradition. One night, after a particularly heated argument, Elizabeth made a decision that would change her life forever. She packed her belongings, gathered Adewale in her arms, and under the cover of darkness, she left the palace. She had arranged for a villager to help her reach the nearest town, where she could catch a flight back to America. With tears in her eyes, she glanced back at the village she had come to love, knowing that she might never return. When King Adisa awoke the next morning, he found a note from Elizabeth explaining her decision. She could no longer remain in a place where her son's future was limited by customs that she could not accept. She loved Adisa deeply, but her love for her child and her desire to give him a life of endless possibilities was stronger. Back in America, Elizabeth and Adewale began a new life. She enrolled him in school, where he quickly excelled, and she continued to teach him about his African roots. Though they were far from Ibala, Elizabeth made sure that Adewale never forgot the village of his birth and the father who loved him. She knew that one day, he would return to Africa, not as a stranger, but as a bridge between two worlds, an heir to the throne of Ibala who carried both the wisdom of his ancestors and the knowledge of the modern world. Years passed, and though Elizabeth never returned to Ibala, she remained connected to it through the stories she told her son. Adewale grew into a strong, intelligent young man, proud of his heritage and determined to honor both sides of his identity. One day, when the time was right, he would return to the land of his father and his people, bringing with him the best of both worlds. And so, the tale of the White Queen of Ibala became a legend, a story of love, tradition, and the unbreakable bond between a mother and her son.